Proving that human morality has an objective biological basis seems like it'd be a poor way to try and prove that morality ain't objective. But Dr. Craig's going to give it a try anyway. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book On Guard by Dr. William Lane Craig. So far in his book, Dr. Craig has brought up the first cause argument, the cosmological argument, and the argument from design, each of which is basically an argument from creation myth. You take something in the real world, and you arbitrarily assign credit for it to some invisible, unfalsifiable, magical being. Like God, for example, although it really could be any magical person or force you can imagine. It's just a creation myth after all. So I was thinking about the argument we's covering currently, which is the argument from morality, and danged if that don't turn out to be an argument from creation myth too. If and we assumes for the sake of argument that objective moral values do exist, then Dr. Craig's argument boils down to, here's something we find in the real world, and I was going to assign credit for it to an invisible, unfalsifiable, magical being of my own choosing. It's just another creation myth. And we can see that with Dr. Craig's syllogism. Whoa. 1. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. 2. Objective moral values and duties do exist. 3. Therefore, God exists. End quote. And when we say that if A does not exist, then B does not exist, what we're saying is basically that A is responsible for the existence of B. Let's apply the exact same logic to a slightly different situation. Quote, 1. If magic elves do not exist, Keebler cookies do not exist. 2. Keebler cookies do exist. 3. Therefore, magic elves exist. End quote. Here again, we've taken something that actually exists in the real world and was given credit for it to some kind of invisible, unfalsifiable, magical characters, and then we's claiming that the existence of the real thing proves the existence of the magical thing. And that's the exact argument that Dr. Craig is making here. Even if we grant the assumption that objective moral values is real, the best case scenario for the argument from morality is that it's an argument from creation myth. And you can make up any creation myth you want because creation myths is just fantasies. So we could stop right here because we know already that Dr. Craig ain't going to be able to build a compelling proof for God out of a simple creation myth. But on the other hand, where's the fun in that? Let's let him drive on ahead and see how he tries to turn this dud into gold. And before we start with the first premise, there's a couple distinctions he wants to make. Quote, first, notice that I distinguish between values and duties. Values have to do with whether something is good or bad. Duties have to do with whether something is right or wrong. End quote. Now, Dr. Craig is usually a pretty good writer, but for once I was going to criticize his explanation here. I think the idea of values versus duties is less confusing without his cutesy attempt to contrast good and bad with right and wrong. It's simpler to just point out that the word duty implies some kind of obligation to do something, whereas value does not. But now let's hear his second distinction. Quote, second, there's the distinction between being objective or subjective. By objective, I mean independent of people's opinions. By subjective, I mean dependent on people's opinions. End quote. And now we're starting to get into the meat of the issue. But notice, this ain't the standard definition of objective versus subjective. It's kinda in the ballpark, but it's incomplete. And in particular, it's being just a bit coy about who exactly is meant by the term people. And this gets into what's classically known as the Euthyphro dilemma. Because if God is also a person, then to paraphrase Plato, we has to ask, is something good or bad because God says so? Or does God say so because it's good or bad? Or in other words, Where does God supposedly get his morals from? And there's different ways you can answer that, and each different answer poses different problems for the apologist, as we'll see later on. Meanwhile, I'm pretty sure that in this context, Dr. Craig means people in the sense of ordinary human beings, specifically excluding God. When he says subjective, he means it's just an ordinary, uninspired, and effectively arbitrary personal preference that don't carry no weight with nobody else. In other words, he's trying to stack the deck so that if someone says morality ain't objective, you can easily dismiss that person's morality by saying that their morality is just a personal opinion. And that's important because the goal here for Dr. Craig is to argue for moral standards that can impose certain specific Christian values and duties on folks that ain't Christian. When he says objective, he don't just mean independent of folks' opinions. He means a moral standard that he can use to claim to have the authority to tell other folks what they must and must not do. He'll claim that this authority ultimately comes from God, of course, but God ain't here, which coincidentally leaves Dr. Craig in the position of exercising that authority on God's behalf. And of course, that also means that Dr. Craig himself ain't going to be personally accountable for the demands he tries to impose on others on account of he's just the messenger, don't you know? So, yeah, this is a classic time-honored Christian scam, and the reason apologists like Dr. Craig keeps trying to pull it is because, honestly, it's been a huge success, historically speaking. Folks has been falling for it for as long as they's been priests. Anyways, on to his defense of premise one. He starts with an argument in defense of objective moral values, which he says require God. Quote, so consider first moral values. Traditionally, moral values have been based in God, who is the highest good. End quote. And let's just stop right there to give a friendly wave to Euthyphro. What standard of good are we using to measure God by here? What quality does God possess that constitutes the greatest degree of goodness? If there's some kind of objective standard of goodness that you can compare God to so as you can measure how good he is, then moral standards ain't based on God, they's based on the objective standard that you's measuring God against. But if there ain't no standard outside of God that you can use to measure goodness, then you's just comparing God against himself. He could be a baby-eating, puppy-crushing sexual predator, and you'd have to call that good because he's the standard of good you're using to define what good is. Now, the reality here is that there is, in fact, a standard of goodness outside of God, and Christian theologians is just trying to exploit that goodness so they can give God credit for it and use that to inflate God's authority. And since believers claim to be exercising God's authority on his behalf in his absence, what they's really doing is inflating their own authority. But of course, Dr. Craig can't admit that without undermining his own supposed authority, so he's just going to try and make it sound like there ain't no alternatives. And that's where he's going to get into trouble. Quote, but if God does not exist, what is the basis of moral values? End quote. And this is an excellent question. It ranks right up there with questions like, if Santa Claus does not exist, then where do the presents come from? Dr. Craig clearly means this to be a purely rhetorical question, and too bad for him, but in fact it has a pretty clear and unmistakable answer, which we can discover by looking at who actually enforces moral values. Who praises you when you help the proverbial little old lady across the street? Who gives you a ticket if they catch you driving 50 in a 35 zone? Who approves of you if you rescue a kitten out of a tree? Who disapproves if you ain't had a bath in about a month or more? Well, I'll give you a hint. It ain't any God. It's other folks. And of course, Dr. Craig will immediately object and say, well, wait a minute, what about the Holocaust? If German society in the 1930s and 40s approved of throwing Jews and immigrants and LGBT folks into concentration camps, does that make it right? And the answer is no, it don't. It's possible for societies to adopt moral codes that ain't moral or right. Morality does come from human beings, but that don't mean they's automatically good at it like you might expect them to be if some supreme deity had written a perfect moral law on their hearts. But then, if morality comes from human beings, and you can't necessarily trust human opinion on the subject of morality, then how do you know what's right and what's wrong? Well, go back to what morality is. Morality is the learned experience of the human species trying to figure out how best to get everybody to get along. So good is going to mean pro-social ideals and behaviors that tend towards justice and compassion and tolerance and cooperation, because them's the things that over human history has proven to do the best job of promoting a society where everybody gets along and has the most satisfying quality of life. And of course, bad is going to mean antisocial standards and behaviors that promote bigotry and abuse and oppression and exploitation. Because over the course of human history, societies that practice that kind of moral code has turned out to be the worst at helping folks to get along with one another and enjoy any kind of decent quality of life. So humanity is learning over time to adopt practical standards of right and wrong that promote pro-social attitudes and discourage antisocial ones. And notice, this ain't because anybody sat down and arbitrarily decided that pro-social was good and anti-social was bad. It's just something that happens automatically as folks naturally pursue their own self-interests. Let's say we has a group of 8 people who want to all do something together, and 2 people want to do one thing and the other 6 want to do another. If when they do the first thing, 2 folks will be happy and 6 will be unhappy, and vice versa if they do the second thing instead. And let's say that the 2 folks happens to exercise a disproportionate influence over the group as a whole. Like maybe they's rich and famous and the other 6 ain't, or maybe they's just dominant personalities or whatever. And let's say that over time the group notices that they's always doing what the 2 people want instead of what the other 6 want. Well, it's what's going to happen as that group steadily accumulates experience. Well, the 2 people's going to start to take it for granted that they're just naturally entitled to dictate what everybody else does. But the other 6 might start to question whether they's really getting enough out of the group to make it worth participating. They's going to lose enthusiasm and maybe even push back a little, and some might even drop out completely. Now let's suppose that there's lots of groups around, and some is dominated by a tiny minority who's continually frustrating the wishes of everybody else and taking advantage of them, while other groups has members who cooperate with one another so that everybody gets a voice in what the group does, and everybody has a good time at least most of the time. Which groups are going to be the most admired and desirable groups to join? Which kind of group would you rather join? So the point of this story is that over time, the success or failure of the group is going to reflect how good a job it does in satisfying the most members. Nobody needs to arbitrarily decide that the most successful group is going to be the one that does the best job and makes it worthwhile for the most folks. That's just how it's going to work. And that's how it does work for human society over the course of human history. A society is only as strong as the folks who make it up, and societies that maximize cooperation and tolerance and compassion and justice is going to produce the strongest citizens. So it's true that you can temporarily have societies like Nazi Germany where antisocial attitudes and behaviors is declared to be the moral standard, but they're going to end up serving as a bad example for the rest of us to learn from. Assuming that we's willing to learn to improve our moral standards and challenge the intolerant and bigoted standards of the past. And of course, the trouble is that some folks ain't willing. Some folks don't see morality as the natural fruit of a human desire to get along. They see morality as an authoritarian construct intended to maintain existing power structures. And if you try to explain actual real world morality to them, they're going to get confused because they can't see how you could exploit that to exercise power over other folks. And they'll say things like, well, then how can you say that Nazi Germany was wrong? Because to them, right means I has the authority to command you to do that, and wrong means I has the authority to forbid you to do that. But of course, genuine real world morality ain't going to give them that authority because genuine real world morality promotes equality and justice and tolerance towards folks with harmless differences. And equality and fairness ain't what they want. They want a society that privileges them above other folks. So yeah, there's an inescapable conflict between authoritarian so-called morality and actual real-world morality. And if we want to see the kind of society that actually benefits its participants, we're going to have to fight for it. But back to the book. Dr. Craig don't want to bother with all that reality-based stuff about where morality actually comes from. He just wants to claim that none of that actually exists. And he uses a straw man version of naturalism to try and make his case. Quote, the most popular form of atheism is naturalism, which holds that the only things that exist are the things described by our best scientific theories. End quote. And pardon me for just a tiny tangent here, but I don't particularly care for the term naturalism. As soon as you start discussing the difference between the natural and the supernatural, there's a sense in which you're assuming the existence of the supernatural by default. At the very least, you're assuming that it has a definition that's sufficiently coherent to allow you to tell the difference between what's natural and what's supernatural. Just by framing the discussion in terms of natural versus supernatural, Dr. Craig is setting up a subtle implication that atheists and skeptics is simply biased against certain types of facts. And I don't think we ought to let him do that. Forget about natural versus supernatural. Let's just talk about objective reality and how we can most reliably and verifiably tell the difference between what's consistent with objective reality and what ain't. And if it turns out that some kind of God or spirits or whatever can be shown to be consistent with reality, then fine and dandy, but you has to be able to demonstrate it first. That said, the definition that Dr. Craig gives here is remarkably poor. It simply ain't true that atheists and skeptics reject the existence of everything that ain't currently described by scientific theories. There's plenty of stuff that we know is real, even though we ain't worked out yet exactly how it works. And dark energy and dark matter are two that come immediately to mind. But more fundamentally than that, science ain't in the business of denying the existence of things like subjective preferences, personal ambitions, and social interactions. Sure, these is things for which we ain't got specific mathematical formulas, but that don't mean that atheists and skeptics denies that they exist. Dr. Craig is using a deliberately oversimplified and reductionist definition of naturalism because he wants to be able to say that science can't account for the existence of morality. Oh, but science is morally neutral. You can't find moral values in a test tube. It follows immediately that moral values don't really exist. They're just illusions of human beings. End quote. And boom, there it is. It's either all black or all white. Either morals come from God or else they don't exist at all. They's just illusions. And of course, he's talking here about authoritarian morals, the kind you can use to claim authority to force other folks to submit to your demands. If he was talking about real-world empathy-based morality, then obviously test tubes wouldn't have nothing to do with it, because human society don't happen in a test tube. But real-world morality don't provide any support for the false dichotomy he's trying to make here. He wants to claim not just that morals can't exist without God, but that human beings is morally worthless unless some outside force assigns them an arbitrary moral value. Quote, even if the atheist is willing to go beyond the bounds of science, why think, given an atheistic worldview, that humans are morally valuable? End quote. And he goes on to complain that if there ain't no God, that means moral values is a byproduct of evolution, a practical experience of primate species benefiting from social cooperation, like baboons, for instance. Which is kind of ironic considering he just got done trying to claim that moral values ain't got no scientific basis. And now here he is giving a simple, straightforward explanation of the scientific basis that he says don't exist. And of course, he tries to make it sound like having a scientific basis is a bad thing. Quote, as a result of socio-biological pressures, there has evolved among Homo sapiens a sort of herd morality, which functions well in the perpetuation of our species. End quote. But of course, it ain't just the perpetuation of the species. Pro-social behaviors improve the whole quality of life for everybody, which is what leads us to adopt what Dr. Craig disparagingly calls a herd morality, as if there was something base and demeaning about morality having a biological basis. But think about what he's actually referring to here. He's saying that moral behavior has practical benefits among all social species, including humans. It's like good nutrition. Most species try to eat healthy food that function well in the perpetuation of the species. Does that mean there's something degrading about humans also trying to eat healthy? But now we come to the punchline. Quote, but on the atheistic view, there doesn't seem to be anything about Homo sapiens that makes this morality objectively true. End quote. And here I just has to shake my head in pity. Dr. Craig has just got done describing the objective fact that moral behavior is demonstrably beneficial in the survival of social species, and in their quality of life as well, although he was careful not to mention that part. And yet, somehow, for Dr. Craig, that ain't enough. It's a reality-based discussion of how reality-based morality is compellingly practical and beneficial in a social group, and yet that ain't enough because it don't give Dr. Craig the authority to force other folks to obey his particular demands. And so he starts to preaching, quote, for us to think that human beings are special and our morality is objectively true is to succumb to the temptation to speciesism, an unjustified bias towards one's own species. End quote. And shame on humans for being biased in favor of humans, right? Except that don't logically follow at all. Recognizing that humans is subject to the same moral pressures and benefits as every other social species is the exact opposite of claiming that humans is special and unique somehow. It's like claiming that good nutrition is beneficial for all non-human species, and therefore it's an unjustified bias towards humans to say that the principles of good nutrition apply to humans as well. And I can't close out this section without quoting Dr. Craig's summary. Quote, so if there is no God, any basis for regarding the herd morality evolved by Homo sapiens as objectively true seems to have been removed. Take God out of the picture and all you're left with is an ape-like creature on a speck of solar dust beset with delusions of moral grandeur. End quote. Except, of course, his whole reason for rejecting so-called herd morality is because it does have an objective basis in biological fact. And yet, to acknowledge this is somehow, in Dr. Craig's view, quote, delusions of moral grandeur, end quote. But I'll leave it as an exercise for the reader to work out who's really having delusions of moral grandeur here. And I'm sure there's more that could be said. That's going to about do it for me for today. Next time we're going to pick up with Dr. Craig's argument for moral duties and with any luck, he's going to end up disproving his own case like he did today. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.